32 nations against one. A combined defense budget of $1.3 trillion versus just $126 billion. And an air force that outnumbers the enemy 3-1. By every metric, NATO should crush Russia in a conventional war. So why is the alliance rushing to rearm? And what are the specific Russian superweapons that still keep NATO generals awake at night? Let's analyze the true balance of power in the most destructive war scenario ever imagined. NATO versus Russia if full-scale war ever broke out between these two parties.
It would likely be the most destructive war ever fought. It would mean the world's second most powerful armed forces pitted against the most powerful, the U.S. combined with the forces of 31 other nations, 4 of whom the UK, France, Turkey, and Italy are also ranked in the top 10 most powerful militaries. On paper, Russia wouldn't have a chance. In terms of resources, manpower, and weaponry, the alliance holds a large advantage. In all likelihood, too large for Russia to overcome in a conventional war. A nuclear war between the two sides will almost certainly result in a mutually assured destruction. Yet despite its current superiority, NATO is intending to grow even mightier. NATO members have agreed to dramatically increase their defense spending, from around 2% of GDP to around 5% during the next decade, while greatly improving interoperability, logistics, surveillance, and cybersecurity. So let's take a closer look at just how massive NATO's military is, how it shapes up against Russia, and what chinks in its armor this massive rearmament campaign intends to fill. Now, one of the best characterizations of NATO's power in recent years was given by the recently retired former UK Chief of the Defence Staff, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin. In his keynote speech at Chatham House Security and Defence Conference in London in February 2024, he stated that Britain is safe. We are safe because we are part of NATO, the world's largest and strongest alliance, and also because we're a responsible nuclear power. The inescapable fact is that any Russian assault or incursion against NATO would prompt an overwhelming response. NATO's combat air forces, which outnumber Russia's 3-1, would quickly establish air superiority. NATO's maritime forces would bottle up the Russian Navy in the Barents and the Baltic, just as Ukraine pushed the Black Sea Fleet from Crimea. NATO has 4 times as many ships and 3 times as many submarines as Russia. This is an alliance that's becoming stronger all the time. It grew from 30 to 32 nations when it added Finland in 2023 and Sweden in 2024. It has a collective GDP 20 times greater than Russia, and they have a collective defense budget 3.5 times more than Russia and China combined. Plus, NATO has the additional strategic depth of a population of over 1 billion. And sitting above all of this is NATO as a nuclear alliance. He's not wrong on any of these counts, and he left out a couple of other areas where NATO is oversized compared to Russia. Take manpower, for example, and the population resources that could be drawn upon to swell and replenish their ranks in wartime. Most estimates put the size of the Russian armed forces in 2025 at around 3.5 million total personnel. It's unclear whether that figure takes into account its large losses during the war in Ukraine, although with seemingly steady conscription rates, perhaps they've been able to maintain or even grow their numbers. It's hard to tell. That figure consists of around 1.3 million active soldiers, with a further 2 million reservists and 250,000 in paramilitary units. By comparison, NATO's combined forces number over 8.65 million, almost 2.5 times as many. The advantage is roughly similar across all 3 categories. NATO is around 3.44 million active soldiers, 4.3 million reserve forces, and around 87,600 paramilitary forces. As for the two sides' ability to scale up their forces in the future, the gap is even starker.
Russia has a total population approaching 141 million. Of those, around 46 million are fit for service, and another 1.26 million young men are reaching military age in the near future, roughly the size of the current number of active duty soldiers. So with potential armed forces being 13.5 times greater than current armed forces, there's significant capacity for Russia to corral huge numbers into the armed forces if needs be. NATO has a total population of 980 million, nearly 7 times larger than Russia's. Of those, 365.3 million are fit for service, with a further 11.6 million soon to be the same. In other words, NATO members currently utilize a far smaller proportion of their populations in their militaries, which gives NATO the capacity to expand its personnel by almost 44 times if needs be. A more than threefold advantage over Russia. Of course, as the old saying goes, an army travels on its belly, and the more forces you have, the more funding you need for them to be effective. Financial and economic resources to sustain a military, let alone a war, have always been as important a component of warfare as manpower and weapons. And in this regard, NATO's advantage over Russia is even greater. When adjusted for purchasing power parity, or PPP, Russia's GDP is around $5.8 trillion, with a defense budget of $126 billion, the third highest spend of any single nation-state. In the PPP determination, where monetary flows are measured in the currency in which they're transacted, not dollars, Russia's defense spending is just 2% of GDP. Ridiculous for a country in the midst of a major war. But even using the nominal GDP model, which measures cost in U.S. dollars, it's still only around 7%. Russia also still has fairly strong underlying economic fundamentals, despite all its sanction-related woes. With foreign exchange and gold reserves of over $597 billion, it also has an external debt of $317.6 billion, just 5.4% of GDP adjusted for PPP. Yet NATO's PPP GDP is almost 10 times larger at over $57 trillion. Its combined defense budget is more than $1,380 billion before the increased spending that its members have committed to, a slightly higher ratio than Russia at 2.4%. NATO members have combined foreign exchange and gold reserves of more than $3.128 trillion, over 5 times Russia's. However, it does have an external debt of more than $69 trillion, around 82% of GDP. Technically, that means it should be harder and more expensive for NATO to raise the funds necessary to conduct an active war. However, with the major financial markets of New York, London, Frankfurt, Paris, Rome, and more within NATO, and Russia currently almost completely excluded from the Western-led global financial system, the opposite is true. It's currently much harder for Russia to raise funding externally, period. Moving on to military hardware, NATO also dominates in the traditional 3 categories of air, naval, and ground force power. NATO's air forces have a total of 20,376 aircraft, compared to Russia's 4,292, an almost 5-fold advantage. NATO has 6 times more fighter aircraft, almost twice as many attack aircraft, 3 times as many transport planes, over 7 times as many special mission aircraft, 5.5 times as many helicopters, and nearly 30 times as many tankers. In addition to a huge quantitative advantage, there's also a significant qualitative advantage over multiple domains.
In terms of pilot training and operational capability, NATO pilots generally fly significantly more hours annually, about 3 times the average of Russian pilots, leading to superior tactical proficiency and readiness. This training advantage is compounded by NATO's advanced command, control, and communication systems, which enable more effective joint operations and deconfliction between air, ground, and
air defense forces. While a grinding 4-year war in Ukraine has sharpened some of these processes, it's an area where Russian forces have historically struggled technologically. NATO possesses a decisive edge in fifth-generation fighter aircraft, with 20 European NATO members committed to operating the F-35 Lightning II alongside the U.S., a platform that offers advanced stealth, sensor fusion, and network warfare capabilities. While Russia has developed the fifth-generation Su-57, it's not considered a true fifth-generation fighter by Western standards and has seen limited combat use. In addition to greater numbers in all classes of aircraft, NATO's air forces also benefit from a broader array of advanced enablers, including air-to-air refueling tankers, reconnaissance platforms, and electronic warfare assets, which are critical for sustained operations in contested environments. Furthermore, NATO's air power is supported by a robust satellite navigation system, Galileo, which is considered superior to Russia's GLONASS system, enhancing precision and operational reliability. These combined advantages in fleet size, training, technology integration, and support systems give NATO a decisive qualitative edge in air combat capability over Russia's air forces. The situation is echoed on and below the waves. With almost 24,000 miles of coastline, unsurprisingly, Russia has one of the largest navies in the world. Russia has an estimated 419 total hulls, with a combined naval tonnage of just over 1.26 million tons. This total includes a single problematic aircraft carrier, 10 destroyers, 12 frigates, 83 corvettes, 63 submarines, more on those in a minute, 123 offshore patrol vessels, and 47 mine warfare vessels. By comparison, NATO has 2,689 total hulls, giving it a 6.5-time advantage over Russia. It's unclear what the total naval tonnage of NATO's fleet is, but with 17 aircraft carriers compared to Russia's 1, the advantage is likely to be significantly more pronounced. In addition, NATO has 13 helicopter carriers, while Russia has none, and 101 destroyers and 128 frigates, more than 10 times as many as Russia. Russia does have slightly more corvettes, 83 versus NATO's 69. But NATO, again, holds a significant advantage in the number of submarines. With 147, NATO also has 497 offshore patrol vessels and 180 mine warfare vessels, a roughly fourfold advantage. In both cases, as it does in the air, NATO also holds a significant qualitative advantage at sea, although in this case, the differences are largely shaped by divergent strategic doctrines, technological capabilities, and geographic priorities. NATO's doctrine emphasizes power projection, interoperability among allies, and blue water operations across the Atlantic, Mediterranean, and beyond. Russia, on the other hand, focuses on regional dominance, asymmetric capabilities, and defense in depth, particularly in contested zones like the Baltic and Black Seas. Not that that's worked out well for them in the Black Sea, where Ukraine's drone warfare has forced what remains of the fleet to retreat from around Crimea. Further east along the Russian Black Sea coast, by contrast, NATO's qualitative edge lies in carrier strike groups, advanced anti-submarine warfare, or ASW systems, and integrated command structures, whereas Russia compensates with potent submarine fleets, long-range anti-ship missiles, and coastal defense networks. In terms of potential for power projection, there's no comparison between the two. NATO's 17 aircraft carriers and 14 amphibious assault ships enable large-scale air and amphibious operations far from home waters. Russia operates just a single aging Admiral Kuznetsov-class carrier with limited combat effectiveness and no amphibious carriers. underscoring its focus on protecting its coastlines rather than expeditionary warfare in the meantime. One area where Russia does hold a qualitative advantage is in submarines, particularly in stealthy diesel-electric and nuclear-powered attack submarines like the Vashovyanka and Yasin class, optimized for ASW in confined seas. It's 12 ballistic missile submarines that ensure second strike nuclear capability. NATO, while possessing more submarines overall, relies heavily on U.S., Virginia, and Ohio-class subs, with European allies contributing smaller, regionally focused fleets. However, NATO's integrated ASW networks using maritime patrol aircraft, sonar arrays, and allied coordination provide superior detection and response capabilities above the waves. NATO's surface fleet is more technologically advanced as well as larger. Many of its destroyers and frigates, for example, the USS Arleigh Burke class and Spanish F-100, are equipped with Aegis combat systems and long-range air defense, offering fleet protection, ballistic missile defense, and strike operations. Russia fields fewer but heavily armed surface vessels, such as the Admiral Gorshkov-class frigates, armed with Zircon hypersonic cruise missiles and Caliber land attack cruise missiles, closing the gap in powerful strike potential despite smaller numbers. Moreover, NATO benefits from superior shipbuilding capacity, maintenance infrastructure, and R&D investment, the latter particularly evident in the U.S. and UK. The alliance leads in unmanned systems, electronic warfare integration, and network-centric warfare. Russia, on the other hand, faces chronic delays in modernization and limited production capacity, but prioritizes asymmetric capabilities like hypersonic missiles and stealthy submarines to offset its numerical and structural disadvantages. On land, the comparison provides some surprising results. The equipment counts is more even, and Russia even has a numerical advantage in some categories, despite its massive losses in Ukraine. Russia maintains a fleet of over 131,000 military vehicles in total. That includes an estimated 5,750 tanks, 3,000 multiple launch rocket systems, or MLRS, and more than 13,000 pieces of artillery. NATO, for its part, has almost 11,500 tanks, twice as many as Russia, but a third fewer MLRS systems at 1977, and around 20% fewer artillery pieces at 10,279. Again, the numbers don't tell the whole story. NATO's land forces are characterized by a focus on high-intensity conventional combat, advanced technology, and interoperability among member states, which provides a significant qualitative edge in areas such as command and control, precision strike capabilities, and combined arms operations. The alliance also benefits from superior logistics, mobility, and the ability to rapidly reinforce forward-deployed forces through air, sea, and land routes, despite challenges posed by Russian anti-access, area denial, A2AD capabilities in regions like Kaliningrad. In contrast, Russia's land forces emphasize mobility, firepower, and the ability to conduct large-scale combined arms operations, particularly near its borders. While Russia has narrowed the qualitative gap with NATO in conventional capability since 2008 through military reforms and modernization, its forces still face significant challenges in training, morale, and logistical readiness. The Russian military's ability to conduct mass mobilization and sustain prolonged conflict is also considered limited, and Russia's combat effectiveness has been rightly questioned in Ukraine. Although there are signs that the military is adapting to modern warfare, such as in the use of drones, indeed, although Russia's many failures in Ukraine are well documented, the fact that huge numbers of its forces and the vast majority of its systems now have extensive combat experience potentially gives Russia a considerable edge. NATO's combat engagements have been limited following its withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021 and Syria and Iraq more recently. There is one question remaining, perhaps the most pertinent, as Russia's war in Ukraine terminally weakened its ability to wage war beyond Ukraine, for example, by invading the Baltic states. Or is this just the start of an extended imperialist land grab? Opinions differ quite widely, with some experts feeling that Russia is a spent force whose collapse is just a matter of time, while many have been sounding the alarm that NATO should prepare itself for imminent war with a resurgent Russia in the next few years. Indeed, many seem to hold both views at the same time. The logical contradiction in this position is obvious. How can Russia be simultaneously collapsing and preparing to invade Europe? There's only one way this makes logical sense, and that's if NATO is in even worse state than Russia. As you can see from the numbers we've presented so far, that's simply not true. So perhaps the truth is that neither of the original positions is true. Either, i.e., Russia is neither collapsing nor preparing to invade Europe. Russian President Vladimir Putin has long insisted that Russia has no intention of attacking or invading Europe, and that his actions in Ukraine are to prevent what he sees as an existential threat to Russia from NATO expanding right onto his doorstep. In Ukraine, of course, his invasion of Ukraine directly caused long-neutral Finland to join NATO, effectively putting NATO on his northern border. But the position of Russia's long border with Ukraine and the long-standing enmities and complicated relations between the two nations undoubtedly make NATO in Ukraine a much more challenging prospect. For one thing, if the current estimate of Ukraine's armed forces of close to 900,000 is correct, the simple addition of Ukraine's forces to NATO's would increase NATO's advantage by roughly a quarter. Russia does have several advantages over NATO that Russia could exploit while NATO is still building up its forces under the new rearmament plan. In particular, NATO's air defenses against drone and missile attacks on its eastern front, a weak point as has been exposed during the wave of drone incursions across Europe, the majority of which appeared to have been launched from inside the territory of the affected countries. Many member states lack effective defenses, and in some cases, policy to combat these kinds of hybrid attacks effectively, let alone the kind of drone and missile swarms Ukraine has to deal with a few times a week. However, with the expedited construction of a drone wall taking place, helped by Ukraine's expertise in drone warfare, that gap is currently being filled. When it is, the only real advantage that Russia has left is temporary, in hypersonic missiles production of drones of all sizes, and Russia's new range of so-called nuclear superweapons like the Burevestnik, Adayeshnik, Poseidon, Avangard, and Sarmat systems. If these systems work as claimed, which is by no means certain at this point, they represent a qualitative advantage that NATO can't yet match. While comparable weapons are in development, Russia, for now, has a large and potentially critical head start. The thing is, with the exception of the Deryashnik, these new Russian superweapons are all nuclear-capable weapons, and that's the scariest part of a potential confrontation between NATO and Russia. Given NATO's overwhelming superiority in conventional weapons, would Russia even attempt a conventional war? Ground maneuvers, air raid, long-range missile strikes, etc.? Or would it escalate directly into nuclear strikes with its enormous nuclear arsenal, knowing that, as Admiral Radakin laid out, a conventional war would almost certainly lead to a devastating loss for Russia? Putin recently hinted at this prospect overtly. We're not going to war with Europe. I've said that 100 times. But if Europe suddenly wants to fight us and starts, we're ready right now, Putin told reporters in Moscow ahead of peace talks with the U.S. delegation. This statement was widely reported in the Western press, but they almost uniformly neglected to report on what he said next. If Europe suddenly starts a war with us, I think it will end very quickly. This is not Ukraine. With Ukraine, we're acting with surgical precision, carefully. This is not a war in the direct modern sense of the word, he said, adding that if Europe does clash with Russia, Moscow will soon have no one to negotiate with. That's as clear a sign as any that if a conflict between NATO and Russia goes kinetic, Russia isn't intending to get bogged down in a conventional war. It's extremely unlikely to win. It's going to go nuclear, and quickly. Let's hope we never have to find out for real whether Putin's bluffing about that. Now make sure you subscribe to the channel and click the bell to enable notifications. Thanks for watching.